They hit me with a $40,000 fine for a workshop that wasn't even on their property, and when I proved it with documents they couldn't dispute, what happened next will blow your mind. Picture this. I'm standing in my handcrafted cedar workshop, dawn breaking over the mountain ridges, steam rising from my coffee mug, holding a manila envelope that's about to expose the biggest HOA corruption scandal in Colorado history. The scent of fresh pine shavings mixed with morning dew still clung to my work boots from yesterday's final touches on the custom cabinets. That outrageous violation notice was staring at me from my workbench, demanding $40,000 for an unauthorized commercial structure built 200 feet outside their legal reach. But here's what they didn't know about property surveys, criminal HOA conspiracies, and what happens when you corner a master carpenter who's got 35 years of building experience and absolutely nothing left to lose. What would you do if your HOA tried to extort you for something on your own ancestral land? And hey, let me know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments. I guarantee you've got your own HOA nightmare stories to share. My name's Marcus Rodriguez, and 3 years ago at 48, I thought I had life figured out. 35 years in custom carpentry and construction, a thriving workshop business, and enough savings to semi-retire with my wife, Elena, cheering me on from our kitchen garden. Then ALS changed everything overnight. When Elena's diagnosis came, watching her deteriorate over 18 brutal months taught me that life's too precious to waste on other people's approval. After her funeral, I found myself wandering through our house in Meadowbrook Commons like a ghost, haunting his own life. Every beige wall approved by the HOA felt like a prison cell, and those perfectly identical lawns reminded me of all the adventures Elena and I had planned but never took. That's when I remembered my grandfather's 60-acre homestead up in the Colorado Rockies, a piece of wilderness he'd left me that I'd barely visited since childhood. The land sat roughly 400 yards beyond the last HOA street marker, where suburban conformity finally surrendered to actual wilderness and elk trails. Standing there that first morning, breathing mountain air sharp enough to cut glass, listening to my diesel generator rumbling to life in the distance, I knew exactly what needed building. A workshop. Not just any workshop, a cathedral to craftsmanship where a man could create beauty without someone measuring his fence height. 35 years in construction teaches you one fundamental rule: permits first, hammers second. I'd watched too many contractors get destroyed by building without paperwork, so I drove straight to Mesa County offices and filed for everything structural, electrical, commercial use permits. Cost me an extra $800, but those bright yellow placards would prove my 200 square foot workshop was legitimate as Sunday church bells. Enter Margaret Blackstone. Margaret's the kind of woman who introduces herself with her full HOA credentials like she's announcing nobility. Meadowbrook Commons Board Chairwoman Margaret Blackstone, she'd declare, standing military straight in power suits that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgages. At 62, she carried herself with the rigid bearing of someone who'd spent decades in corporate law, and I swear she still had that predatory smile they teach in hostile takeover seminars. She ran our 7-person HOA board like her personal empire. Meadowbrook Commons was her masterpiece of control. Every mailbox painted regulation charcoal gray, every driveway sealed to exact specifications, every tree planted from her pre-approved botanical list. The woman actually carried a digital caliper in her briefcase. I'd seen her measure neighbors' holiday decorations down to the millimeter. Margaret had perfected what I call executive intimidation, that special tone that makes community standards sound like a death sentence. She'd smile that razor-thin smile whenever addressing me, always managing to work in subtle reminders about maintaining property values, while her eyes conveyed exactly what she thought about blue-collar tradesmen who didn't know their place. The morning everything exploded, I was installing hand-carved window trim when I heard the distinctive purr of premium German engineering on gravel. Margaret's silver Mercedes pulled up to my property boundary, and out she stepped in designer heels that immediately began sinking into the forest loam. "Mr. Rodriguez," she called with artificial sweetness, navigating toward me like she was crossing a minefield. "I trust you've secured proper authorization for this endeavor." I gestured toward my bright yellow permit display mounted on a nearby aspen. "County says it's completely legal, ma'am." Her smile flickered like a fluorescent bulb with loose wiring. County permits are merely one consideration. HOA compliance is an entirely separate matter. That should have been my warning, but I was focused on getting those window joints perfect. Frankly, I assumed any rational person would understand that HOA authority ended where their street signs stopped. 3 weeks later, the certified letter arrived. $40,000 for a workshop built on land that had been in my family since before her precious HOA even existed. Sitting on my half-completed deck, bitter coffee going cold in my hands, I read those final words. Ignorance of community covenants provides no exemption from enforcement actions. That's when I learned something crucial about bullies in positions of power. They depend on you being too exhausted to fight back. They calculated wrong. The next morning, I did what any reasonable neighbor would do, called Margaret directly. No sense escalating when a simple conversation could resolve the misunderstanding. After all, we were part of the same community, and community members should handle disputes like civilized adults. Mrs. Blackstone, this is Marcus Rodriguez. I received your notice about the workshop, but there's clearly been some confusion. The property sits outside HOA jurisdiction. The pause stretched long enough for me to hear my coffee maker finishing its cycle, followed by what sounded suspiciously like papers rustling. When she finally responded, her voice carried that same corporate venom that made my jaw clench. Mr. Rodriguez, I appreciate your outreach, but our authority encompasses all member properties regardless of geographical specifics. The covenants are unambiguous on this issue. Ma'am, respectfully, I have county surveys that clearly demonstrate... I'm certain you do. Nevertheless, our legal counsel has examined the circumstances comprehensively. The violation stands. Good afternoon. Click. I stared at my phone for a solid 2 minutes, listening to the dial tone and wondering if I'd somehow fallen through a portal into an alternate reality where property boundaries were merely suggestions and HOA chairwomen ruled by divine mandate. The smell of burning coffee snapped me back to reality. Apparently, righteous fury doesn't prevent kitchen appliances from overheating. Within 10 days, Margaret launched what could only be described as a psychological warfare campaign worthy of Pentagon strategists. First came the complaint to county building enforcement, claiming I was operating an unlicensed commercial facility without proper zoning permits. The bitter irony wasn't lost on me. She was weaponizing my own permits against me, twisting legal construction into something criminal. Then the whisper campaign commenced. I'd catch fragments of conversations at the hardware store, neighbors suddenly finding their phone screens fascinating when I approached. Poor man's obviously struggling since his wife passed, I heard someone murmur near the lumber section. Grief does terrible things to judgment. Nothing quite like small-town gossip to make you feel like you're swimming in a fishbowl filled with sharks. But Margaret's masterpiece was recruiting homeowners as her personal surveillance network. Suddenly, every time I drove toward the mountain access road, neighbors would materialize from behind perfectly manicured shrubs like suburban ninjas, all wielding smartphones and concerned expressions. When lumber delivery trucks reached my workshop site, residents would emerge from behind trees like wildlife photographers snapping pictures of my suspicious activities. The breaking point arrived when she had the audacity to appear at my front door with a clipboard and that predatory smile. "Marcus," she said like we were longtime friends sharing afternoon coffee, "I've been considering our little predicament. Perhaps we can negotiate some accommodation." "I'm listening." "If you were to cease construction immediately and remove the existing structure, we might consider reducing the penalty to a more reasonable amount, say $8,000 for administrative processing costs." I looked at this woman standing on my doorstep, graciously offering to reduce her completely fabricated fine by 80%, and something fundamental shifted inside me. You know that moment when you realize someone considers you stupid enough to fall for their scam? That metallic taste when your blood pressure spikes and your vision starts tunneling. "Mrs. Blackstone," I said carefully, "I think it's time I conducted some research of my own." Her smile flickered like a candle in a windstorm. Research into property records, survey documentation, maybe even those original HOA covenants you keep referencing. That Tuesday morning found me at Mesa County Courthouse, armed with strong coffee and grim determination. 35 years of dealing with building inspectors had taught me something valuable. Bureaucrats might move slowly, but their documentation never lies. Every property line, every easement, every covenant gets recorded and filed in triplicate, creating a paper trail more reliable than DNA evidence. The first revelation came when I located the original Meadowbrook Commons Incorporation documents. Turns out HOA boundaries aren't just informal agreements. They're legally defined and mapped precisely like municipal limits, and they must file exact boundaries with the county recorder when they incorporate. The second surprise was discovering that my grandfather's 60 acres had been deeded and recorded 22 years before Meadowbrook Commons even broke ground. The land was what attorneys call grandfathered, existing property rights that cannot be superseded by subsequent agreements, regardless of how official the letterhead appears. But the real bombshell was buried in the HOA's own covenant documentation. Section 18B, subsection 7, stated in beautiful legal language that the association's jurisdiction extended exclusively to properties within the platted boundaries as recorded with Mesa County on September 3, 2009. I sat there in that courthouse basement surrounded by the musty smell of archived documents and the fluorescent buzz of government lighting, reading that sentence 5 times to ensure I wasn't hallucinating. My workshop wasn't just outside their authority, it was legally impossible for them to have any jurisdiction whatsoever. Time to hire a professional surveyor. Carlos Mendez came recommended by the county assessor as someone who doesn't tolerate nonsense and knows property law like his own family genealogy. At 58, Carlos had the weathered appearance of someone who'd spent 35 years arguing with property lines and winning consistently. "Let me guess," he said when I explained the situation, adjusting his well-worn Broncos cap. "HOA thinks they own everything visible from their neighborhood." "Something like that." Carlos chuckled while setting up his equipment, morning mist swirling around his survey scope like spirits of ancient disputes. "Son, I've seen this movie countless times. These suburban kingdoms always assume property lines are suggestions. GPS satellites don't lie, though. Neither does quality surveying." 4 hours later, we had our definitive answer: 1,247 feet. My workshop sat exactly 1,247 feet outside Meadowbrook Commons' legal boundaries. I immediately sent certified copies of the professional survey to every board member, along with a courteous letter requesting they withdraw their violation and issue a formal public apology. Margaret's response arrived within 36 hours. "Surveyor error. Violation upheld. Pay immediately or face property lien." That's when I realized this had never been about property boundaries. This was about power, control, and a woman who would rather destroy a neighbor than admit error. A property line on my family home for a workshop that wasn't even in her jurisdiction. That threat hit differently than the fine itself. The fine was theoretical money, painful but not life-destroying. A lien on my primary residence meant threatening my home, my equity, everything Elena and I had built together over decades. Margaret had just escalated from neighborhood nuisance to genuine menace. She wasn't finished. Within a week, a pristine Blacktown car glided into my driveway, disgorging a man in a $2,000 suit carrying a leather attaché that probably cost more than my monthly utilities. Behind him emerged Margaret, wearing her most concerned neighbor expression and clutching a manila folder thick enough to strangle a mountain lion. "Mr. Rodriguez," the suit announced, extending a manicured hand. "I'm attorney Harrison Webb from Webb, Sterling & Associates. We represent Meadowbrook Commons Homeowners Association." I'd heard of their firm. They specialized in what they euphemistically called community governance disputes, which was legal speak for crushing homeowners who challenged authority. Their highway billboards featured smiling attorneys standing before gated communities with slogans like "Protecting your investment" and "Standards matter." "We're here to address your unfortunate circumstances," Webb continued, opening his attaché with theatrical precision. The cease and desist order he presented was a masterpiece of legal intimidation, 28 pages of whereas clauses and heretofore declarations that essentially boiled down to "stop building immediately or we'll make your existence miserable in ways you cannot imagine." But here's where Margaret made her critical tactical error. She got greedy. While Webb droned about community harmony and property value protection, Margaret began her own inspection tour of my yard. I watched through my kitchen window as she measured the gap between my fence and sidewalk with her digital calipers, photographed my mailbox positioning, and, I kid you not, counted the decorative river rocks in my landscaping. That's when it clicked. This had never been solely about the workshop. She was building a comprehensive violation case, hunting for any excuse to pile on additional penalties. The woman was literally prospecting for infractions, like she was on some twisted HOA treasure hunt. The next morning delivered a fresh, certified letter. Apparently, my mailbox was 3.7 inches beyond regulation distance from the sidewalk. Violation, $750. My fence stain had weathered below community aesthetic standards. Violation, $1,200. And my truck, the same pickup I'd been parking in my driveway for 9 years, was now classified as a commercial vehicle prohibited in residential zones. Violation, $1,800. I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by legal documents and violation notices, feeling like I was drowning in bureaucratic quicksand. The aroma of fresh coffee couldn't quite mask the bitter taste of injustice settling in my throat. That's when I remembered something my old union foreman used to say. When management starts throwing around expensive lawyers, it's time to educate yourself about their game. Back to the courthouse I went, but this time with a different mission. If Margaret wanted to play by legal rules, I needed to understand exactly what those rules actually were. 4 days of digging through public records taught me something fascinating about HOA operations. They're required to file annual reports with the Colorado Secretary of State, including detailed financial disclosures. And those financial statements told an intriguing story. Meadowbrook Commons HOA collected approximately $280,000 annually in dues and assessments, but their reported expenditures revealed a curious pattern. Legal fees alone accounted for nearly $78,000 last year, 28% of their entire budget. For a community of 180 homes where the biggest controversy was usually Christmas decoration timing, that seemed excessive. Then I found the real treasure buried in their vendor payments. Webb, Sterling, and Associates had received $94,000 over the past 24 months, supposedly for covenant enforcement activities. That worked out to roughly $4,000 per month in legal fees for a neighborhood where people mostly argued about lawn maintenance schedules. Either Meadowbrook Commons was the most litigation-heavy community in Colorado history, or someone was getting very comfortable spending other people's money on legal intimidation. I decided to test a hypothesis. That evening, I went door to door throughout the neighborhood with a simple question. Have you ever received legal threats from our HOA? The responses were illuminating. Patricia Williams got fined $1,200 for planting wildflowers instead of approved begonias. David Chen faced a $2,000 penalty for installing solar panels that were aesthetically disruptive. Sandra Lopez received a cease and desist for operating a home-based tutoring service that violated commercial activity restrictions. Every single violation had generated expensive legal correspondence from Webb's firm. Every homeowner had ultimately paid, rather than fight. The pattern was unmistakable. Margaret had transformed HOA enforcement into a revenue stream, with Webb as her collection agency. But here's what she hadn't counted on. I was semi-retired, furious, and had nothing but time to dig deeper. The next morning, I filed a formal complaint with the Colorado Department of Regulatory Agencies, requesting a comprehensive audit of Meadowbrook Commons HOA's financial practices. Then, I sent a certified letter to every homeowner in the community, detailing the legal fee expenditures and asking pointed questions about where their money was actually going. Margaret's response came swiftly, another certified letter threatening defamation charges for spreading false and malicious information about HOA operations. But something had fundamentally changed. This time, her threats felt desperate rather than intimidating. She was running scared, and we both knew it. Scared people in positions of power don't retreat gracefully. They double down aggressively. The next escalation arrived as an emergency community meeting notice delivered under every door in Meadowbrook Commons. The subject line read, "Urgent community safety concerns regarding rogue member activities." The meeting was scheduled for Friday evening at the community center, with an agenda that made my blood pressure spike just reading it. Item 1, discussion of member harassment and defamation activities. Item 2, special assessment proposal to fund legal defense against frivolous complaints. Item 3, potential suspension of membership privileges for community disruption. Translation: Margaret planned to paint me as a dangerous troublemaker, bill every homeowner to fund her legal war chest, and attempt to expel me from the HOA entirely, which ironically might have solved my original problem if she weren't still claiming authority over my workshop. The woman had a remarkable gift for turning victory into defeat through sheer vindictiveness. I spent 4 days preparing for that meeting like an attorney prepping for trial. Carlos Mendez, bless his surveyor's soul, helped me create a visual presentation showing exactly where HOA boundaries ended and my property began. We printed aerial photographs, boundary maps, and copies of those damning financial reports on poster boards visible from the back row. Friday evening arrived gray and misty, with that persistent Colorado drizzle that makes everything smell like wet pine and approaching storms. The community center hummed with nervous energy as neighbors filed in, many clutching copies of my letter about legal fee expenditures. I could see the division immediately. Margaret's supporters clustered near the front, shooting suspicious glances toward the growing group of homeowners who'd started asking uncomfortable questions about their money. Margaret opened the meeting wearing her most authoritative charcoal blazer and a smile that could have frozen boiling water. Thank you all for attending tonight's emergency session. We're here to address serious concerns about a member who has chosen to disrupt our community harmony through harassment and false accusations. She gestured toward me like I was a particularly offensive piece of roadkill. Mr. Rodriguez has been spreading misinformation about HOA finances and legal activities, apparently in retaliation for legitimate covenant enforcement. Tonight, we must decide how to protect our community from this pattern of destructive behavior. That's when I stood up, poster boards in hand, and asked the question that changed everything. Mrs. Blackstone, before we discuss my alleged harassment, could you explain to everyone exactly where the HOA's legal authority begins and ends? Her confident expression wavered. Our authority encompasses all member properties as clearly outlined in our covenants. I walked to the front of the room, unfolded my first display board, and pointed to the aerial photograph showing Meadowbrook Commons' platted boundaries highlighted in red. According to Mesa County records, our legal jurisdiction ends here at Mountain View Drive. My workshop is located here. I pointed to a spot clearly outside the red boundary, 247 feet beyond our authority. Murmurs rippled through the crowd like stones thrown in still water. Patricia Williams, the woman fined for unauthorized wildflowers, raised her hand. If Mr. Rodriguez's workshop is outside our boundaries, why are we penalizing him for it? Margaret's voice adopted that patronizing tone reserved for explaining obvious concepts to slow children. Property boundaries are more complex than simple survey lines, Patricia. Our covenants include provisions for— No, interrupted a voice from the back. Carlos Mendez had arrived, still wearing his work clothes and carrying a rolled document that crackled when he moved. Property boundaries aren't complex at all. They're legally defined, professionally surveyed, and officially recorded. And this workshop sits on grandfathered land that predates your HOA by 22 years. The room erupted in conversations as Carlos unrolled an official county survey map and spread it across the front table. Homeowners crowded around, pointing and asking questions, while Margaret stood frozen like a deer caught in headlights. That's when David Chen, the solar panel victim, raised the nuclear question. Mrs. Blackstone, if we're spending $94,000 on legal fees to pursue illegitimate claims, what other covenant enforcement might be questionable? The floodgates burst open. One by one, homeowners began sharing their violation stories. Sandra Lopez's home business restrictions that didn't exist in the original covenants. Michael Bradley's fence height requirements that contradicted county codes. Jennifer Santos's mailbox color mandate that appeared in no official document. Every single case had generated expensive legal correspondence. Every homeowner had paid rather than fight. The pattern was undeniable. Margaret had been manufacturing violations to generate revenue. This is absolutely ridiculous, Margaret finally exploded, her composed facade cracking like old paint. You people don't comprehend how challenging it is to maintain community standards when dealing with ungrateful homeowners who question every decision. These legal fees are essential to protect your property values. The room fell silent. In that moment, every homeowner realized they were staring at someone who viewed them not as neighbors, but as subjects in her personal kingdom. Carlos Mendez's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Ma'am, protecting property values doesn't require violating property rights, and it certainly doesn't require spending other people's money on fraudulent lawsuits. That's when I played my final card. Speaking of spending other people's money, I said, unfolding my last display board, let's discuss what happened to the $35,000 collected for community park improvements that somehow never materialized. Margaret went absolutely white. The revolution had begun. Margaret went absolutely white, and suddenly the room felt like those moments before a thunderstorm breaks. That electric tension when everyone knows something massive is about to happen. That park fund is being held in reserve pending contractor negotiations. She stammered, but her voice had lost its usual commanding authority. The words came out flat, rehearsed, like she'd practiced this excuse in front of a mirror. For 4 years, David Chen called out from the back, my kids have been asking about that playground since they were in elementary school. They're in high school now. That's when the most unexpected ally stepped forward. Dorothy Martinez, 82 years old and barely 5 feet tall, shuffled to the front, carrying a weathered banker's box that looked like it had survived multiple moves. Mrs. Blackstone, Dorothy said in a voice that carried the authority of someone who'd lived through the Depression and wasn't impressed by corporate bullying, I believe it's time we discussed my late husband Roberto's files. The room went absolutely silent. Even the heating system seemed to hold its breath. Roberto was HOA treasurer for 15 years before his heart attack, Dorothy continued, setting the box on the front table with a thud that echoed like a judge's gavel. He kept meticulous records, old habits from his banking days, you understand. Bank statements, receipts, meeting minutes, correspondence, everything cross-referenced and organized by date. Margaret's face had progressed from white to a sickly green shade that reminded me of week-old guacamole. Mrs. Martinez, I don't believe private financial records are appropriate for— Oh, these aren't private, Dorothy interrupted, lifting the box lid with the deliberate care of someone defusing a bomb. Roberto always said HOA finances should be transparent as window glass. He provided copies of everything to the State Oversight Board every year, just like the law requires. She pulled out a thick manila folder labeled Discrepancies 2020-2023 in Roberto's careful handwriting. You see, Roberto noticed some irregularities before his heart attack, missing receipts, unexplained expenditures, payments to vendors that never provided services. He was planning to address these concerns at the 2023 annual meeting. The folder hit the table with a slap that made everyone jump. But then Roberto had his heart attack, and you, Mrs. Blackstone, volunteered to take over his duties during his recovery. Very generous of you. Very convenient. I watched Margaret's hands begin to shake as Dorothy spread Roberto's meticulously organized documents across the table. Bank statements showing checks written to non-existent contractors, invoices for legal services that cost 4 times market rate, payments to Meadowbrook Property Solutions, LLC, a company that, according to Roberto's research, existed only on paper and shared Margaret's home address. Roberto spent his final months trying to reconcile these discrepancies. Dorothy continued, her voice never rising above conversational level but somehow commanding absolute attention. He calculated approximately $73,000 in unexplained expenditures over 4 years, money that should have gone to community improvements, snow removal, actual maintenance. The number hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. That's completely false, Margaret managed, but her voice cracked on the last word. Roberto was confused after his heart attack. These records are unreliable. Dorothy's eyes turned arctic. My husband's mind was sharp as a tack until the day he died. Young lady, are you suggesting that 40 years of professional banking experience suddenly evaporated because of a minor heart episode? Carlos Mendez leaned over the documents, his surveyor's eye catching details others might miss. Ma'am, these bank records show systematic patterns. This isn't confusion. This is documentation of deliberate financial manipulation. The pieces started clicking together in my mind like tumblers in a lock. Margaret's aggressive pursuit of my workshop fine wasn't about property values or covenant enforcement. It was about generating cash flow to cover the money she'd already stolen. The manufactured violations, the excessive legal fees, the special assessments, all designed to replace funds she'd diverted to her personal accounts. She hadn't been running an HOA. She'd been operating a sophisticated embezzlement scheme, using legal intimidation to silence anyone who asked too many questions, and my refusal to pay that bogus $40,000 fine had threatened to expose the entire operation. The question now, Dorothy said, closing Roberto's folder with finality, is what we're going to do about it. That's when I realized this was no longer just about my workshop. This was about justice for an entire community that had been systematically robbed by someone they'd trusted to protect their interests. The war was far from over. It was just beginning. The war was just beginning. But now I had an army. The meeting ended with Margaret storming out, muttering threats about elder abuse and malicious prosecution, while half the community center erupted in angry conversations about stolen money and violated trust. The other half sat in stunned silence, processing the reality that their HOA chairwoman had been systematically robbing them for years. Dorothy Martinez, bless her heart, invited everyone interested in pursuing justice to her house the following evening. I'll make coffee and tamales, and we'll sort this mess out properly, she announced in that no-nonsense voice that had probably organized church fundraisers and managed school board meetings for decades. 28 homeowners showed up at Dorothy's living room, transforming her cozy space into mission control for what Carlos dubbed Operation Justice. The aroma of fresh coffee mixed with the determined energy of people who'd finally had enough of being pushed around. Carlos had brought reinforcements, specifically his friend Benjamin Cross, a retired prosecutor who specialized in white-collar crime and harbored a particular hatred for corrupt officials. At 68, Ben carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent 45 years making criminals very uncomfortable in courtrooms. First things first, Ben said, spreading legal documents across Dorothy's dining table like a general planning a campaign. We need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. From what I've seen tonight, Mrs. Blackstone has committed multiple felonies: embezzlement, fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and racketeering. He pointed to Roberto's meticulously organized evidence. The beauty of financial crimes is that they leave paper trails. Every forged check, every fake invoice, every unauthorized transfer creates evidence that's admissible in both civil and criminal court. Patricia Williams raised her hand like she was back in school. What about those bogus fines she's been charging everyone? Are those illegal too? Absolutely, Ben replied with the satisfaction of someone who'd been waiting years to explain this particular legal concept. HOAs can only enforce legitimate covenants that actually exist in your recorded agreements. Manufacturing violations to generate revenue is fraud, plain and simple. That's when I learned something that should be taught in every civics class in America. HOAs are actually corporations subject to state oversight and federal regulations just like any other business. They can't simply invent rules and demand money any more than your local bank can suddenly decide you owe them rent for using their ATM. Carlos pulled out his laptop and started creating what he called our evidence inventory. We've got Roberto's financial records, survey maps proving the workshop jurisdiction issue, and documented patterns of fraudulent enforcement. But we need more. Sandra Lopez, the tutoring business victim, volunteered to canvass every household in Meadowbrook Commons, documenting every questionable fine and violation notice from the past 4 years. If we're doing this, we're doing it right, she said with the determination of someone who'd been waiting years for revenge. David Chen offered his IT skills to analyze digital records and create databases. Michael Bradley, being a retired IRS investigator, volunteered to cross-reference every HOA expenditure with actual community improvements. The strategy that emerged was elegant in its simplicity. We'd simultaneously file complaints with 4 different agencies: the Colorado Secretary of State for corporate fraud, the Mesa County District Attorney for criminal embezzlement, the Colorado Department of Regulatory Agencies for HOA violations, and the FBI for potential racketeering charges. Meanwhile, Ben would prepare a civil lawsuit to recover stolen funds and damages. The key, Ben explained while Dorothy refilled coffee cups, is coordination. We hit them from multiple directions simultaneously, so they can't focus their legal resources on any single front. But our secret weapon was something Margaret had never anticipated: community solidarity. Michael Bradley's investigative background meant our financial evidence would be bulletproof. Sandra's organizational skills would ensure every homeowner's story was properly documented. Carlos's surveying expertise would establish definitive property boundaries for any future disputes. And Dorothy became our moral center, the living reminder that we were fighting for more than money. We were fighting for the principle that neighbors shouldn't steal from neighbors, and positions of trust shouldn't become opportunities for theft. The most satisfying part of our planning session came when Carlos suggested we install security cameras around all our properties. If Margaret's desperate enough to steal $73,000, she's desperate enough to try intimidation or sabotage, he warned. Sure enough, we didn't have to wait long to test that theory. 5 days later, while I was installing custom cabinet doors in my workshop, savoring the smell of fresh cedar and the satisfying sound of precision joints clicking into place, I heard the distinctive crunch of footsteps on gravel. My new security camera caught a figure in dark clothing attempting to damage my generator with a tire iron. The expensive Italian hiking boots were a dead giveaway. Margaret had graduated from legal intimidation to actual vandalism. But unlike her previous victims, I was ready. We all were. The footage went straight to the sheriff's department, with copies to our attorney and the district attorney's office. Criminal charges for vandalism and trespassing were filed within 18 hours. More importantly, the community rally that followed proved that Margaret's reign of terror was officially over. Neighbors who'd been afraid to speak up for years suddenly found their voices, sharing stories of harassment and illegal fines that painted a picture of systematic abuse spanning nearly a decade. The hunter had become the hunted. The hunter had become the hunted, and Margaret was beginning to realize just how cornered she'd become. The vandalism charges hit her like a sledgehammer to her carefully constructed reputation. Within hours of the sheriff's visit, the story spread through Meadowbrook Commons faster than wildfire in August. The woman who'd spent years lecturing neighbors about community standards had been caught on camera destroying property with a tire iron like some common criminal. But instead of backing down, Margaret doubled down with the desperation of someone watching their entire world collapse. If I thought criminal charges would humble her, I was about to learn how dangerous a cornered narcissist could become. Her first move was hiring a crisis management firm. Apparently, there are actually companies that specialize in cleaning up the messes of corrupt HOA officials. Within 72 hours, anonymous flyers started appearing on car windshields throughout the neighborhood, claiming I was a mentally unstable grieving widower who'd been harassing board members and threatening community safety. The flyers were professionally printed, complete with graphics and bullet points about my pattern of aggressive behavior. They even included quotes from concerned neighbors, describing my obsessive vendetta against legitimate HOA governance. The whole thing read like political attack ads designed by someone who'd studied psychological warfare. But Margaret's masterstroke was the social media campaign. Fake Facebook profiles started posting in local community groups, sharing carefully crafted stories about my erratic behavior and threats against board members. The posts were subtle enough to avoid obvious defamation, but persistent enough to plant seeds of doubt about my credibility. Carlos discovered the first fake profile when his daughter tagged him in a post about dangerous homeowners who threaten property values. The profile claimed to belong to concerned Meadowbrook resident Sarah Johnson, but Carlos's reverse image search revealed the profile photo belonged to a stock photography model from Minnesota. "She's trying to control the narrative before our evidence goes public," Ben Cross observed when we gathered at Dorothy's house to review the attack campaign. "It's actually a smart strategy. Discredit the messenger before people hear the message." That's when we discovered just how deep Margaret's corruption network ran. Michael Bradley's forensic accounting had uncovered something that made our original embezzlement allegations look like petty theft. The fake Meadowbrook Property Solutions LLC that had been receiving HOA payments wasn't just Margaret's personal piggy bank. It was connected to a web of shell companies and kickback schemes involving local contractors, legal firms, and even county officials. "Look at this pattern," Michael said, spreading bank records across Dorothy's dining table like he was assembling a 1,000-piece puzzle. Every major HOA contract for the past 4 years went to companies that paid substantial consulting fees to Meadowbrook Property Solutions. Landscaping, snow removal, community maintenance, everything was inflated by 35–50% to generate kickback revenue. The numbers were staggering. What we'd initially thought was $73,000 in missing funds was actually closer to $280,000 in systematic fraud. Margaret hadn't just been stealing HOA money, She'd been running a comprehensive corruption scheme that artificially inflated every community expense to generate personal profit. But here's where things got really interesting. Sandra Lopez's door-to-door documentation project had uncovered something that connected our little neighborhood drama to a much bigger story. 4 other HOAs in Mesa County had reported similar patterns of excessive legal fees, manufactured violations, and mysterious cost overruns, all connected to the same network of contractors and legal firms. We're not dealing with one corrupt HOA chairwoman, Ben realized as the scope became clear. We're looking at organized fraud that extends across multiple communities. This is a federal case waiting to happen. That's when Margaret made her most desperate move yet. The emergency meeting notice appeared under our doors on a Friday evening, calling for a special assessment vote to fund necessary legal defense against frivolous complaints and harassment lawsuits. The proposed assessment, $3,500 per household, payable immediately to protect community assets from malicious litigation. The meeting was scheduled for Monday night, barely enough notice to organize opposition, time to catch people off guard before they could fully understand what they were voting on. But Margaret had miscalculated our community's awakening. Instead of panicking about emergency legal fees, homeowners started asking pointed questions about why we needed $630,000 to defend against frivolous complaints that seemed to have substantial evidence behind them. The email chain that followed was a thing of beauty. Patricia Williams started it with a simple question. Has anyone actually seen evidence that Mr. Rodriguez's complaints are frivolous? Within hours, 31 homeowners had responded with their own stories of questionable fines, excessive fees, and suspicious contractor relationships. By Sunday evening, it was clear that Margaret's emergency assessment would fail spectacularly. Not only would homeowners vote it down, but the very act of calling for it had created the perfect forum for presenting our evidence to the entire community. That's when she played her final, most desperate card. The anonymous tip to Child Protective Services claimed that my unstable mental state and obsessive behavior made me a danger to neighborhood children. The complaint alleged that I'd been stalking families and making threats that created an unsafe environment for minors. It was a masterpiece of malicious manipulation, designed to trigger an investigation that would tie me up in bureaucratic hell for months while destroying my reputation in the community. But like all of Margaret's schemes, it was based on lies that couldn't withstand scrutiny. And by now, scrutiny was something we'd gotten very good at providing. The CPS investigation lasted exactly 6 hours. The caseworker, a tired-looking woman named Janet Rodriguez, no relation, who'd probably seen every flavor of neighbor revenge in her 25-year career, showed up at my door Tuesday morning with the weary expression of someone processing her 4th bogus complaint of the week. Mr. Rodriguez, I'm here about a report concerning potential safety issues involving children in your neighborhood. I invited her in for coffee and laid out the entire situation, the HOA corruption, the fraudulent fines, Margaret's escalating desperation, and our community's efforts to expose systematic theft. Janet took notes while I showed her the security footage of Margaret vandalizing my property, Roberto's financial records, and the documented pattern of manufactured violations. Let me guess, Janet said after reviewing the evidence. The person who filed this complaint is the same one facing potential criminal charges for embezzlement. That would be correct. She closed her notebook with a snap that sounded like a judge's gavel. Mr. Rodriguez, in my experience, people who steal money from their neighbors rarely have genuine concerns about child safety. Consider this case closed. But Janet's visit triggered something I hadn't expected: media attention. Apparently, false CPS reports filed as retaliation for exposing HOA corruption make for compelling human interest stories. By Thursday morning, a reporter from Denver Channel 9 was calling my phone, asking if I'd be willing to discuss HOA abuse and community corruption for their weekend investigative segment. That's when Margaret made her most catastrophic error in judgment. Instead of laying low while criminal investigations proceeded, she decided to fight fire with gasoline. She called her own press conference, scheduled for Friday afternoon at the Meadowbrook Commons Community Center, announcing her intention to address malicious rumors and defend community integrity against harassment campaigns. The woman actually thought she could control media narrative through sheer force of personality. Carlos and I arrived an hour early to find Margaret setting up a makeshift podium, complete with printed talking points and what appeared to be a professionally prepared slideshow about maintaining property values through strong governance. She'd even arranged folding chairs in neat rows like she was hosting a corporate board meeting instead of defending herself against embezzlement charges. "This should be interesting," Carlos muttered as we watched her practice her opening remarks in front of a mirror she'd propped against the wall. The local media turnout exceeded everyone's expectations. Channel 9's investigative team brought cameras and a producer who'd clearly done her homework about HOA corruption scandals. The Denver Post sent their community affairs reporter, armed with questions about financial transparency in residential associations. Even the weekly Mesa County Tribune showed up, sensing a story that would resonate with their suburban readership. But the real surprise was community attendance. Instead of the handful of loyal supporters Margaret had expected, nearly 90 homeowners packed the community center, many carrying copies of Roberto's financial documentation and their own violation notices. Margaret opened with confidence, reading from prepared remarks about dedicated volunteer service and protecting community investments from frivolous attacks. She painted herself as a victim of harassment, describing my legitimate property boundary complaints as obsessive vendetta behavior from someone clearly struggling with grief-related mental health issues. The first crack in her facade appeared when Channel 9's reporter asked a simple question. "Mrs. Blackstone, can you explain why the HOA paid $35,000 to a property management company that shares your home address?" Margaret's practiced smile faltered. "Those are complex financial arrangements that wouldn't be appropriate to discuss in this forum." "What about the park fund?" called out David Chen from the audience. "Where did that money go?" "Financial details are confidential board matters," Margaret snapped, her composure slipping like makeup in summer heat. That's when Dorothy Martinez stood up in the front row, clutching Roberto's folder like a weapon. "Mrs. Blackstone, nothing about HOA finances should be confidential from the homeowners who pay for them." The room erupted as homeowners started shouting questions about their own violation fines, excessive legal fees, and mysterious special assessments. Margaret tried to maintain control, but 90 angry neighbors demanding answers about stolen money isn't something you manage with corporate speak and deflection. The coup de grace came when Sandra Lopez raised her hand and asked the question that destroyed Margaret's entire narrative. "If Mr. Rodriguez's complaints are frivolous harassment, why did you try to vandalize his property with a tire iron?" Dead silence. The kind of silence that falls when everyone suddenly realizes they're watching someone's world collapse in real time. Margaret's face cycled through confusion, anger, and panic before settling on desperate fury. "That's completely false. This entire meeting is a setup orchestrated by people who want to destroy community governance." The Channel 9 cameras captured every word as she continued her meltdown, accusing homeowners of conspiracy and elder abuse for questioning financial irregularities. She demanded that media leave immediately, threatened to sue anyone who repeated malicious lies, and finally stormed toward the exit while shouting about ungrateful residents who don't appreciate years of dedicated service. But she never made it to the door. Sheriff's Deputy Martinez was waiting in the lobby with an arrest warrant for grand theft, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. The cameras rolled as Margaret Blackstone was handcuffed and led away, her corporate composure finally cracking completely as she screamed about frame jobs and malicious prosecution. The revolution was complete. Justice had arrived with handcuffs and camera crews. But the real climax was just beginning. The arrest footage went viral within hours. By Saturday morning, HOA chairwoman embezzlement arrest was trending on social media across Colorado, with news outlets picking up the story as far away as Texas and New York. Apparently, corrupt HOA officials getting their comeuppance strikes a nerve with frustrated homeowners everywhere. But Margaret's arrest was just the opening act. The main event came the following Tuesday at the emergency HOA meeting called to address what the county prosecutor was now calling systematic financial fraud affecting multiple residential communities. The Meadowbrook Commons Community Center had never seen anything like it. The parking lot overflowed with cars, news vans, and curious neighbors from surrounding developments who'd heard about our little revolution. Inside, every seat was filled, with people standing along the walls and crowding near the windows like they were watching a championship fight. Sheriff's Deputy Martinez attended in an official capacity, along with representatives from the Colorado Secretary of State's office and the FBI's Economic Crime Unit. Turns out our neighborhood drama had uncovered what federal investigators called a multi-jurisdictional conspiracy involving HOA corruption, contractor fraud, and money laundering. The meeting opened with Benjamin Cross presenting our evidence to the packed room. Roberto's meticulously organized financial records were projected on screens for everyone to see. Bank statements showing payments to fake companies, forged signatures on community checks, and documentation of systematic theft totaling $280,000 over 4 years. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ben announced to the silent crowd, "what we're looking at isn't just embezzlement. This is organized fraud that turned your homeowners association into a criminal enterprise." The gasps from the audience sounded like a collective exhale of people finally understanding how thoroughly they'd been robbed. Patricia Williams started crying when she realized her wildflower fine had helped fund Margaret's European vacation. David Chen's face turned red with rage as he calculated how much his family had paid in bogus violations over the years. But the real bombshell came when Carlos presented his investigation into the broader corruption network. Using public records and financial documents, he traced connections between Margaret's scheme and similar operations in 6 other Colorado communities. Meadowbrook Commons wasn't an isolated case. Carlos explained, pointing to a complex chart showing money flows between shell companies and contractor kickbacks. This was part of a sophisticated operation that systematically defrauded homeowners across Mesa County. That's when FBI Special Agent Rebecca Torres stepped forward to address the crowd. At 47, she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent 22 years making white-collar criminals very uncomfortable. Based on evidence provided by your community investigation, Agent Torres announced, we've opened a federal case involving racketeering, money laundering, and conspiracy charges that extend far beyond your neighborhood. This morning, we executed search warrants at 23 locations and arrested 9 individuals connected to this criminal enterprise. The room erupted in shocked murmurs as people realized their little HOA dispute had uncovered a federal case involving millions of dollars in stolen community funds. But the moment that made everything worthwhile came when Dorothy Martinez took the microphone. At 82 years old, she'd become the unlikely hero of our story, and her words carried the moral weight of someone who'd seen enough corruption to last several lifetimes. Roberto always said that democracy works when good people stand up to bullies, she began, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. For 4 years, we let fear keep us quiet while someone stole from our community, but this week proved that when neighbors work together, justice isn't just possible, it's inevitable. The standing ovation lasted 7 minutes. The formal votes that followed were anticlimactic after the emotional release of Dorothy's speech. Margaret and the entire corrupt board were removed unanimously. Emergency elections were scheduled for the following month. All bogus fines and fees were officially voided, with the promise that recovered funds would be returned to affected homeowners. Most importantly, the community adopted what became known as the Meadowbrook Transparency Covenant, a set of governance rules requiring monthly financial reports, open book audits, and homeowner approval for any legal expenditures over $750. But my personal vindication came when the new interim board president, elected by acclamation from the floor, made an official announcement. The $40,000 fine against Marcus Rodriguez is hereby voided, with the board's formal apology for the harassment and illegal enforcement actions taken by the previous administration. The applause was nice, but the real satisfaction came from something simpler. Walking out of that community center, breathing the crisp mountain air mixed with the scent of approaching snow, I realized that my little workshop project had become something much bigger than personal healing. It had become a symbol of what happens when ordinary people refuse to be bullied by corrupt authority. As I drove home past the community center, I could see people still gathered in small groups, sharing stories and making plans for rebuilding their neighborhood's governance. The sound of genuine community conversation, punctuated by laughter and hope, drifted through my truck windows like music. For the first time since Elena's death, I felt like I was part of something larger than my own grief. The healing had begun. The healing had begun, and it spread through our community like wildfire in the best possible way. 8 months later, Margaret Blackstone was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison for racketeering, embezzlement, and conspiracy. The judge's comments during sentencing captured what many of us felt. The defendant violated the fundamental trust that communities place in their elected representatives, turning a position of service into an opportunity for personal enrichment. The federal investigation ultimately recovered $3.7 million in stolen funds across 7 HOA communities, with Meadowbrook Commons receiving $420,000 in restitution, far more than we'd originally calculated. Turns out Margaret's network had been even more sophisticated than we'd imagined, involving fake maintenance contracts, inflated insurance policies, and kickback schemes that stretched back nearly a decade. But the real transformation wasn't measured in recovered dollars. It was visible in the way our neighborhood came alive again. The new HOA board, elected in a landslide vote for transparency and accountability, implemented financial reforms that became a model for communities across Colorado. Monthly budget reports, public contractor bidding, and homeowner approval for all major expenditures turned our association from a dictatorship into an actual democracy. The community park that Margaret's embezzlement had prevented was finally built using recovered funds. But we named it something special, the Roberto Martinez Memorial Park, honoring the man whose meticulous record-keeping had made justice possible. Dorothy cried happy tears at the dedication ceremony, watching neighborhood children play on equipment that corruption had stolen but community action had restored. My workshop, meanwhile, became something I'd never expected, a symbol of resistance that neighbors would point out to visitors as the place where the HOA revolution started. The irony wasn't lost on me that a simple grief project had accidentally sparked a federal investigation and reformed local governance practices. But the most meaningful transformation was personal. Building that workshop had started as therapy for loss, but fighting for it had given me purpose again. Carlos and I turned our collaboration into a formal business. Mountain West Property Rights LLC, helping homeowners across Colorado navigate property disputes and HOA corruption. Turns out there's significant demand for people who know how to read survey maps and aren't afraid of bullies. Dorothy became my unofficial business partner, using her decades of community organizing experience to help other neighborhoods build coalitions against corrupt boards. At 83, she discovered a new calling as what local media dubbed the HOA whistleblower, traveling to communities where homeowners suspected financial irregularities. The ripple effects extended far beyond our little corner of Mesa County. The Colorado legislature passed the Meadowbrook Reform Act, requiring stricter financial oversight for homeowners associations and creating whistleblower protections for residents who report suspected corruption. Similar legislation was introduced in 8 other states, all citing our case as evidence that HOA governance needed fundamental reform. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was watching our community rediscover the meaning of neighborly cooperation. The monthly HOA meetings that had once been exercises in intimidation became actual discussions about community priorities. Neighbors who'd been afraid to speak up for years found their voices, sharing ideas for improvements that would benefit everyone rather than enrich a select few. The annual Meadowbrook Community Festival, funded with recovered embezzlement money, became a celebration of what ordinary people can accomplish when they work together. Local news crews still show up every year to document what they call the HOA that fought back. But for us, it's just become normal life in a functional democracy. As I write this, I'm sitting on my workshop's front porch, listening to the sound of children playing in Roberto Martinez Memorial Park and breathing air that smells like pine needles and possibility. The morning coffee tastes different when you're drinking it in a place you built with your own hands and defended through your own courage. Elena would have loved seeing our community come together like this. She always believed that good people could overcome any challenge if they supported each other through the tough times. Turns out she was right. The workshop walls are decorated now with photos from our victory celebration, newspaper clippings about the federal investigation, and thank you letters from homeowners in other states who used our story to fight their own corrupt boards. But my favorite decoration is simple: Dorothy's handwritten note that says, "Roberto would be proud." So here's what I learned from taking on a corrupt HOA and accidentally starting a federal investigation. Bullies count on you being too tired, too scared, or too isolated to fight back. But when you stand up, document everything, and build coalitions with neighbors who share your values, even the most entrenched corruption can't survive community scrutiny. Now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment sharing your worst HOA nightmare. Trust me, you're not alone in dealing with power-hungry board members who've forgotten they're supposed to serve their communities, not rule them. And if you love seeing bullies get their comeuppance through good old-fashioned community organizing, hit that subscribe button. Next week, I'm sharing the story of how I helped my elderly neighbor get revenge on the contractor who tried to scam her out of her life savings. Because sometimes fighting back isn't just about personal justice. It's about protecting the people who can't protect themselves. Thanks for watching Mountain West Stories. If this episode made you laugh or shake your head at HOA madness, hit that like button and drop your thoughts below. We post HOA corruption exposés and neighborhood justice stories every week, so be sure to subscribe to catch the next unbelievable story.